Good evening, everyone. Welcome. It's wonderful to have such a great group with us this evening as we launch our 2025 Art Meets Science initiative. And we are thrilled to have Dr. Hermann with us. I think most of you in the waiting room know him well. But as you know, he is a physician, he is a scientist, and he is also an art historian and art enthusiast. So we're very, very excited to welcome him back for another series of art and science lectures this year. I think, as all of you know, artists and scientists really look to nature to help us understand the world. And part of their process in doing that is to compare similarities and differences between things, to catalog and categorize things as part of that learning process. And so the theme of these next two lectures is really geared around that process and taking a look at that and learning how that understanding evolves and how that informs what we know and what we understand about the natural world. So our theme, as you will probably notice over the coming year, is really focused around the science of plants and flowers and sort of the connections between those two. So with that, Dr. Haller, welcome. We're excited to hear what you have to share with us this evening.
Well, thank you very much, Cherry. Thank you very much, Emily, for helping me organizing all this. And thank you very much for joining us for what hopefully will be an interesting hour. I apologize before we even start for a lot of slides, for a lot of information, hopefully interesting information. So you can see here the still life as a scientific image. And yes, we will talk mostly about this small but beautiful painting on the left-hand side, which hangs in a corner in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And we have been standing in front of that when we did one of our museums tours, I think almost 2 years ago. And on the other side, on the right-hand side of this slide, you see also a picture. You see a scientific image, and you immediately recognize this as a scientific image. And we'll talk about this a little bit during the introduction. What I want to convince you in my talk is that the still life on the left-hand side and the more modern, immediately recognizable scientific image, that they're basically not the same, but they have the same aim and the same goal. Now here you see this image in full. And the scientific images explain the world. This is why we're using it. And both of these images, they look at nature, and they want to understand nature, and they want to understand the underlying mechanisms. Now, when you look at this, it's a time-calibrated, that's the original title, time-calibrated phylogenetic tree for angiosperms. You may not know that angiosperms are all flowers. So it's all the flowers we know. And this phylogenetic tree is based on 353 genes. And using this genetic approach, Suntini et al. In Nature last year, they made a map where all the flowers come from. So this will be an interesting lecture to discuss in the future. But for now, we'll return to the painting from around 1600. So a tool to understand the world, to understand the complexity of nature, and I think we all agree immediately that this painting is very complex, but also the underlying principles. And as I said, this is the hypothesis, and you will see at the end whether I was convincing or not. We will go back in time because I strongly believe that going back in time helps you to understand our times better. However, it will be foreign. I like the sentence, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there, and they definitely look at things differently, even if they want to understand the same. So this is the painting. It's made and painted by Christoffel van den Bergel. He's Dutch, as you can see from the name. It's called Still Life with Flowers in a Vase. It's from 1617. As I already mentioned, it's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. We have lots of flowers. You can see immediately 3 tulips. At that time, the most expensive flowers in the Netherlands. They are striped tulips, which makes them especially expensive. You see irises, you see cyclamen, you see narcissus, you see roses, both in different colors, and you see a lot of other flowers. We'll come back to this, but you immediately recognize that this or these are not flowers which grow or blossom at the same time. So this is something the painter has compiled there. In addition to that, you can see that the flower vase is in a very elaborate small niche. The shadows you can see are really wonderful, and you can see butterflies, you can see insects, you can see some porcelain there. Looks like this is Chinese porcelain, and you see some shells there. So it's what we call a still life, and we'll discuss the different levels of that and find out why this painting was done, in which context the painting was done, and what I draw conclusions from the painting and the context. So we are not going to talk about still lifes as a genre. The genre started at that time. You can see this on the left-hand side. And some of you may remember Philadelphia, the Museum of Art. We then talked next about the other still life, which is by Cézanne next to it. And you see lots of different still lifes. And this is an interesting history. And still lifes are an important genre. But we are not going to talk about still lifes in general, using still lifes as a genre, because we start where the genre actually started. So these still lifes we will look at from Christoffel and from others, they were the first ones where still lifes were independently used, and as I will hopefully convince you, were used as scientific images. The Dutch, or better, the painters from the Netherlands, they are very good at painting flowers. And even before they started with still lifes, with flowers in a vase in their own right, they were the world masters in painting flowers. And this shows you Hugo van der Roos. That's the so-called Portinari triptych. It's now in Florence in the Uffizi Gallery. And it was bought in the Netherlands by the Portinari family, and then they brought it to Florence. And I can tell you this was an uproar, because the Florentine, these famous Renaissance painters, they had never seen flowers like this. And immediately Botticelli, and some of you know that, started to paint like this. And another example, a very early example, is this wonderful portrait of a young man praying from 1485, which is in Madrid in the Thyssen Museum. And the vase with flowers you see here with these lilies, they are not an independent painting, but they are basically on the back of the painting. So it's a portrait, and for additional decoration, they have used these flowers. So these are early forerunners of still lifes. It all began with Ambrosius Bossert and others. He was not the only one, but the most famous one. He lived from 1573 till 1621, and the years, it will all be around 1600 or into the 1600s, and I'll give a brief historical introduction in a moment. So this is vase of flowers in a window. It's in the Hague Museum in the Netherlands. And you can see it's basically composed very similar to the one by Vandenberg on the right-hand side. We have a vase, we have different flowers. The flowers are organized so that we have a variety of flowers. Obviously, color plays a role, so we can identify the individual flowers, and the vase is packed. And then we have also shells here. We have an extra flower. We have insects, not as many as in the Vandenberg painting, but those paintings were painted in the town or the small city of Middelburg in the Netherlands. I don't know anybody has heard about Middelburg, and to be honest, I have not heard of Middelburg because now it's a small town in Zealand. But at that time, most flower paintings came from Middelburg, and the painters in Middelburg were famous for that. And the first question is, why? What has Middelburg to do with flower still lifes? So this shows you Middelburg around 1600. It's in Zealand. This is next to the North Sea, and you can see it looks like a typical medieval small town in the Netherlands. However, at that time, around 1600, it was very industrious. It was famous for its trade. It was the entry port for all the wines coming in from Spain and France into the Netherlands. It was one, not the center, but one of the centers of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, and they owned the world. It had many painters. It was an important center of lens grafting and microscopy. So you can see there is some relationship with MDIBL with regard to microscopy, also with the wines, although we as entry port are not that important, but they painted flowers there. Why? When you look at the city, and this is a map from 1575, and I've just given you a description of that, then you look at this city and what you see is gardens everywhere. So this was not unusual for the Netherlands, but it was especially in Middelburg that there were rich owners of gardens. They cultivated plants. I've told you that it's near the sea, so a lot of exotic, for the last 100 years, a lot of exotic flowers and plants have come into the Netherlands and especially Middelburg. So there were rich people, merchants, scientists, medical doctors, and they had gardens and they cultivated flowers in there, and were interested in these flowers, and they paid the painters to paint this. Now we need I think, a short discourse in history of the Netherlands. So that's a map of the Dutch Republic from around 1650. And you can see here the Zuider Sea, that's in the north. We are only talking about the south. So this is where these rivers, you can see the River Schelde entering into the North Sea, where we have this green area. And you can see Zealand, this is one of the provinces of the Netherlands. And the center of everything was Antwerp. Antwerp, during that time in the 16th century, was the Manhattan of the known Western world. Wall Street was there. All the shipping went through Antwerp. It was extremely rich. And there were scientists, there were painters. It was, as I said, one of the richest cities in Western Europe. However, the Dutch people had started to fight for their independence, and I think you as Americans can sympathize with that very early on. Since 1558, they were fighting the Spanish because the Spanish, they owned this huge empire from Chile to the Russian border. This was all Spain. And the Dutch wanted to have their independence, and they were fighting for 80 years. And you can see two examples in this small country, battles, raging battles going back and forth. You may know that the Dutch had this wonderful strategy that they opened the dikes, and then the North Sea came in, and they drowned quite a lot of the Spanish troops during these wars. So everything we're talking about is on the background of an ongoing warfare during the whole period of time. And then they declared independence in 1581. The northern provinces, everything north of Antwerp, declared independence. And this meant that all the people from the south, especially from Antwerp, were coming into the Netherlands, especially the southern parts. So Middelburg, Leiden, and Amsterdam, they started to flourish. Amsterdam became then, 100 years later, the most important city in the Netherlands and one of the richest on the planet. But Middelburg also flourished. So this is why we have the rich people there, an influx of painters from Antwerp. The whole tradition of Antwerp swept into Middelburg, Leiden, and Amsterdam. I've seen this already. And this was all the time when the Netherlands became a world power. This is a world map. And I show you in this map here, in red, all the colonies of the Netherlands in the 1600s. So all of a sudden, this small country, which may seem insignificant, becomes very, very important, because you can see they owned all of Indonesia and part of the Philippines. They owned everything in South Africa and other parts, and they owned land in South America. They only gave this up not longer than 20 years ago. They still own islands in the Caribbean, as you know, and they owned New York. So this is a letter just to remind us all, 1626. So this was 8 years before the painting I was talking about was painted. Peter Schaken, when they sailed the East Coast, they bought from the Native Americans for 60 guilders. That's half a month's salary for somebody working on a ship. They paid for Manhattan. They only kept it for a couple of years, and then they sold it again because they thought it swampy and not worth it, and they may have regretted this. It was also the golden age of Dutch painting. Every museum in the world you go to is full of these paintings, which were painted during this very rich and successful period of the Netherlands around 1600 in the 17th century. And it was also the time, and this is why we are having this whole discussion and the conversation about still life in paintings, it was the birth of science as we understand science around 1600. I hope you understand me. I don't mean that there was no science in the Middle Ages or in Roman times or even the Egyptian. They had science, they explained the world, but our approach to do experiments, to really look carefully and to try to understand what's happening in the world from the way we look at it, this all started there. So Francis Bacon is one example, and there were very close relationships between England and the Netherlands at that time. William Harvey, one of the heroes in my profession, studies on the movement of the heart and the blood vessels in 1638. That's the basis of how we understand physiology. And the Netherlands were also a world power in science. They developed the microscope. They looked through the microscope, and then they started painting what they saw there. And you see a couple of examples here. And on the right-hand side, that's Jacob de Gheyn, very famous for his microscopic paintings. This is a portrait by Rembrandt, which is now in London in the Dulwich Picture Gallery. So there was a lot going on, and the level of discussion about science, and this is the point I want to make, was very high. We have a couple of examples from the time, because it was the same time diaries were written and people started to keep daily diaries. And we know, for instance, from Mr. Pabst from London, that he mentioned, oh, we went to the coffee house last night, and there we had a very interesting discussion about where do insects actually come from, and there was a raging conversation on different hypotheses and theories. And it's this background where we will analyze our painting. So coming back to these two paintings, what role plays still lives in this historical context? What did actually people see in there? Because for us, it's mostly decoration. There's a high aesthetic quality, and I think they also realize the aesthetic quality, and that's part of the price people paid for that. You may not know that, but these were highly expensive paintings at the time, and the painters were famous, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So I already talked about the different flowers we see in there. The tulips are very prominent, and the other flowers, and there was a lot of exchange between different cities, between different people with regard to flowers. So tulips, we will not talk about this during this lecture, but tulips were speculated on, and to buy tulip bulbs, you could spend a fortune. So where did the flowers come from? And before I go into all these scientific discussions, I will, excuse me, I will introduce the people who were involved with that. So Matthias Lobelius, he lived in Middelburg. He was one of the educated people owning a garden, and there were quite a few others, and they all talked and wrote letters and asked for flowers and for tulip bulbs. They communicated with Carolus Clusius, the most famous botanist and naturalist in the time around 1600. And he was in Leiden. So there was an intense network of letters, flowers, and paintings going back and forth, not only between Middelburg and Leiden, but with Utrecht, with other cities, and also, as you will see in a moment, with other places in Europe. So Dr. Clusius, actually, he's not a doctor because he studied the law. He never had a medical degree, which is unusual for the time when you're a botanist. But he became professor of botany in Leiden, and he was already 62 years old at the time. He was very famous. And Leiden, you can see here the botanical garden, the Hortus Botanicus at the University of Leiden in 1610. And you can see that the garden is organized. So it's not a wild garden. So there is a strict order, and there are books and lots of essays written on how this was organized, and we'll not go into that, but this is also an important part of science. You can see in the back that there was a museum, and in the front you can see some of the examples, what was in the museum, and we will have our next lecture talking about these collections. But for the time being, this is the garden Clusius was responsible for. When the people in Leiden hired him, he was already famous. He came from Frankfurt. Before that, he had lived in Vienna, and you'll see in a moment he had lived almost everywhere in Europe. He negotiated with the university that since he was not a medical doctor, he could not teach anatomy during the winter. So during the winter, he was only teaching using botanical books, which offended the other professors because normally the professor of botany was doing anatomy during the winter, and Clusius was exempt. He also had to bring his collection. He had a huge collection with him. And for instance, his tulip collection was so famous that people climbed the wall and they stole these tulips all the time, which, by the way, may be important for the Dutch now having tulips all over the place. But he was very mad at that. He complained in letters about that, these impossible people in Leiden stealing my tulips. So this is Dr. Clusius. Now, just to mention the Botanical Garden, and I already said the past is a foreign country, they do things differently there. They had 4 institutions at the university, and they were all equivalent. And we know that they're equivalent because the salaries paid for the professors were identical when you were engaged in the botanical garden or the anatomical theater or the library or the school of fencing. Now, the only weird thing is the school of fencing, and we will not go into the mathematics of fencing, which plays a role here. We will not go into the art of fencing and what this means for university development. Perhaps we'll talk about this at another lecture during the year. What's interesting in the library, you may not see that, but on the right-hand side, there are maps on the wall, and these maps are the gardens of Constantinople. Because to be honest, they tried very hard with their gardens in the Netherlands, but this was nothing to what they had in Constantinople at the time. Tulips, for instance, the Ottoman Empire ordered for one party 100,000 tulips in blue and red. This is almost what you need for Madison Square Garden, for Madison's Avenue in May. And here you see the teaching. This is an engraving from 1601. This is Jacob de Gain. You have seen Jacob de Gain before. You may remember this portrait by Rembrandt, the one who did the microscopy. And he was also engaged at the university. And this may be Dr. Clusius, who is standing there teaching the students and explaining what there are no flowers to see. So it was more important for him to demonstrate that the teaching was done. I don't think that he is explaining what they have seeded there, but it may be. But this gives you an impression of a lecture and the number of students they had at that time at the Botanical Garden. And this is now very important because this painting from Franz Franken, an art cabinet with Abraham Ortelius and Justus Lipsius in 1617, this is exactly where you can see professors doing science. So this gives you the first idea how these paintings were used. And you see these famous people. The one sitting next to us is Abraham Ortelius. He was the first to make a world map in Antwerp. And Lipsius was very famous. I'll have another famous painting by him in a minute. And you can see in front of them, they have these shells and they have other objects. So this is how you do science. You look at objects, you investigate them, you have discussions and conversations about that. But then very interestingly, right next to the table, what do you see? A still life. So this is how they use still life. It was hanging on the wall. Yes, it was decoration, but they used it for scientific discussion. Then interestingly enough, you see, ironically, the vase with flowers on the other side. You see other objects there. You see in the back the library, which means libraries are important, but not that important. Study nature, that's much more important. And paintings are more important than books. So this is how they studied, and this is a very nice example how still lifes were used for studying. I promised you another famous painting. This is in the Palazzo Pitti in Florence. This is one of the more famous paintings of Peter Paul Rubens. It's called The Four Philosophers, but it's basically he himself on the left-hand side, his brother, and then on the right-hand side, Mr. Wauermann, who is a good friend in Rome. But Justus Lipsius, the famous professor, first from Leiden and then in Leuven in Belgium, he is sitting there, and you can see behind him Seneca, the statue, because he had written a very famous book. But what you can see next to it, tulips, flowers. So being as important as classical philosophy are these flowers. And we have letters in more than one letter from Lipsius writing to Clusius, please send me more of these flowers. It's wonderful to study them, and I'm looking at them in my garden, and they exchange their views about what this all meant. So a successful scientist publishes. So I've told you that Clusius was one of the most important, and I've called him now scientist. He didn't like that. In fact, nobody was using the word scientist. This was demeaning at the time. And I learned in Cambridge when we were there a couple of weeks ago that Charles Darwin, when somebody called him a scientist, he got furious and he said, I'm a naturalist. I'm trying to understand the world, and I am not a scientist in the lab doing experiments. That's demeaning. So I think Clusius was a famous naturalist, and he published. So this is one of the books he published, and he published books on plants because that's his specialty. So that's the Exoticorum Libri. Did some 10 books on that, and here you can see tulips, you can see the bulbs, but then you can also see these wonderful drawings and colorful watercolors in the book he published. And there are not only two, there are 700. So there are 700 of these drawings in the books he published. And you can imagine this was costly. And it's beautiful, but it also tries to understand not only the beauty of the flowers, but what the leaves look like, what the roots look like. You can identify actually these plants, and they were characterized because in this book, he's comparing not only one flower like a rose and a tulip or an iris. No, he's comparing flowers from different parts of Europe. And this is what they did. They did expedition into the hills around Bologna, where he studied for a while, into the mountains. So mountains were great because when you climb up the mountains, you come through different areas where you have different flowers within a relatively short amount of time. The flat areas of the Netherlands, you need a garden for that. There is not a lot you can do there, but nonetheless, they tried this. And we have a history at MDIBL about that. One of our early researchers, he's famous for covering the island and describing all the flora on MDI. He published a second famous book, Rariorum Plantarum Historia. It was printed in Antwerp in 1601, which tells you the border was not really shut down. Ongoing warfare, to be honest, around 1600, they had 8 years where no fights were taking place. And here you see these are naturalist books. This is science, a lot of text explaining all this. And we'll come back to the problem of painting versus text in a moment. This is a map of Europe. You have already met Mr. Ortelius, who published this in Antwerp in 1573. And the red circles indicate where Clusius has worked. And this also is very comparable to our times. As a scientist, you travel. As a scientist, you form a network. So he has studied in France, then he worked in Spain for a while, and he published on Spanish, not flowers, but plants. He was in Italy, both in Rome and in Bologna. You'll see this in a moment. He was in Hungary. He published the first book on Hungarian mushrooms in 1683. I think this is hilarious. I would have never thought that a thing like this exists. Why do you go and publish a book on Hungarian mushrooms if you're not Timothy Leary? I mean, this is really astonishing. And then he was in England, he was in Sweden, and he then got the job in Leiden. Not all the career was really successful. For instance, he was the director of the Imperial Garden, flower garden in Vienna. He got the job, but they never built the garden. So he got fed up after 8 years of waiting, and the salary was not paid constantly. And then they made him an offer in Leiden, and he negotiated for the job there. So you can see the letters we have are 1,200 letters written to Clusius by more than 330 correspondents of his network in 6 languages: Latin, French, Italian, German, Spanish, and Dutch. I don't know whether he was really fluent in that, but remember that we'll come back to this question of translation of science in a moment. And one of his heroes was this man, and I don't think a lot of you have heard about Ulysses Aldrovandi. He was professor and director of the Orto Botanica at the University of Bologna. And you all know the University of Bologna is really the oldest university in Europe. 1088. So this is a famous place, and he had the biggest collection of plants. In fact, he collected almost everything, but he was well known for that all over Europe. And you can see some of this, and this is science, question mark, because it's not only the plant, but it's the different stages of how the plant grows. It's also the roots. These are descriptions, and he had a lot of them. So at the University of Bologna, they have this herbarium of the university. These are 15 books, and you can see some of these books here on the slide. And they have altogether more than 1,500 different plants in them. And they have dried plants, and they have these wonderful watercolors you can see on the right-hand side. And he had a whole workshop. So he had hired painters, and he knew exactly what he wanted. He wanted painters who knew about colors and who were good at that. How could he afford that? Because Jacopo Ligozzi was actually the court painter for the Medici in Florence. He was well paid when he joined Aldrovandi in Bologna for a while, but you can see the beautiful watercolors he made for Aldrovandi. So he was one artist. He had more of them in Aldrovandis workshop. And now it becomes very scientific, because Aldrovandi was the first one to raise a topic which for Clusius and all the others was then very important. How do we know that the colors we are using to do these watercolors are real? We want to do science. We want to generate nature, pictures of nature. And in order to do that, in order to communicate that, in order to be reproducible, so it's very scientific for us, how sure are you that you're using the right colors? And in addition to that, how sure are you when you use colors and you use words for these colors and you translate this into other languages, and you have seen how international they were, how sure are you that the word red or variations of red is then translated in Spanish, or they have the total wrong understanding of what's going on? So he worked on colors. This is a book he wrote, De Coloribus, or Trattato dei Colori, which is on the left-hand side, and he made serious descriptions of all hues you can imagine. But from the same book, he also used examples where color and differentiation of color was very important, and this is medicine. This is urine colors. And I'm a nephrologist, so this was what I would have learned in the 1600s, how to differentiate colors of urine and make medical diagnosis of that. He was not interested in medical diagnosis, or not really, but he was interested in these colors and the different use, and what do medical doctors use, and how can we use this for plants? Or perhaps it was the other way around. So he was one of the correspondents of Clusius, and this question of color, of reproducibility, of how you can recognize this, not only on a still life where we have started from, but in scientific books, is pharmacology. Because these are books where herbs were described for medical doctors, for lay person who use these, and you better be reproducible when you tell people this herb you can actually use and give it to people and they get better and not die from it. So this is one example from the 16th century. And here you see these watercolors in these books of pharmacology. And this is by a famous painter, Hans Weitlitz, and the book was edited in Basel. And here you see the research group. These are the people who had to work together. So as always, you have in big the professors. So Otto Brunfels, this was the author. But then you had these painters. You see on the other side, you need a woodcutter. So you need a whole research group in order to be able to produce this. It's not only the editor who is important for editing the book, it's the research group and the exchange between the people working together, looking at these flowers, discussing colors, discussing what should go into this and what shouldn't. And this is what came out of it. So Hans Weitlitz, who painted this in Otto Brunfeld's book, he actually was a pupil of my hero in German painting, and this is Albrecht Dürer. And here it becomes now very interesting because these paintings, these watercolors from Dürer, they were much about 100 years before the still life you're looking at. And to be honest, I still don't know why Dürer made them, because they were beautiful, that's possible, aesthetic, but what was the interest and how much science is in there, this should be the topic of more research in another lecture. But now, after all this, I think you understand this painting, which is a portrait of Rachel Ruiz. She is a very famous painter in Dutch history. Her father was a famous medical doctor and also collector at Leiden University. And she painted in Leiden and then in Amsterdam. And on the right-hand side, you see one of her paintings. This painting actually cost much more than a Rembrandt at the time. So I think the whole history we have from the 19th century that women were doing, the small things like flowers, still lives, and the men were doing the big history paintings. I think that's an invention of the 19th century. So she was very famous, but I'm showing you this because here you can see what you need in order to make a still life. Yes, you need flowers, and she has flowers in front of her, and she's holding one of these flowers, but then you have to really analyze the flowers in order to paint them correctly. And in addition to that, you need books, and quite a few books. This is about as many books I've used in preparing this lecture. And in addition to that, you need drawings. You need scientific tables, and she's surrounded by that. So the color, in order to make these paintings, is only part of it. The science you need in order to get this right and to have what you want to communicate is very important. You can also see that the aesthetic qualities of these flowers, this is now 100 years later or 80 years later, they are really astonishing and wonderful. But for me, it's important that painting still lives, you have a research group and you have to address scientific questions in order to get it right. Now, coming back to our still life, and we have already spent 45 minutes, so I'll try to be fast. When we come back here, we have talked about insects and we have talked about butterflies, we have talked about shells, and I will go briefly through that. And the question is, why butterflies? So it's the same as with the flowers. It's depicting nature. Oh, no, first we'll do shells. I'm sorry. So first we'll concentrate on the shells on the left-hand side. And you immediately see that these are not shells from the North Sea. These are exotic shells. And these shells were collected from where? Whenever a new ship arrived in the harbor of Middelburg, more than 100 small boats went out there, and they were asking questions. What have you brought? Where have you been? What did you find? Can we buy that? In Spain, you couldn't do that. In Spain, the crown confiscated everything immediately and they didn't sell it. But in the Netherlands, this was a free country. Cherry Bauer's ancestors come from there because they wanted to go there where there is liberty and freedom. And they bought all this. So on the one hand, it tells you about the richness of the Dutch, but it's also science. This is the most famous Conus marmoreus, or Rembrandt's shell, and he had this in his own house, collected them also. And this is, as I said, a very famous engraving by Rembrandt, but it shows you that people try to be as detailed as possible. And here you see another still life. This is now still life of shells and corals on a tabletop. So this is not flowers anymore, but you can see the variety of that. And it has the same purpose, to explain the richness, the variability of these different objects, and then try to find out how do they form. There were collections like this from famous collection Römer Fischer, a successful merchant in Amsterdam, in shell collector, and he published his whole collection. Travelers from England at that time thought that the Dutch were crazy. I mean, they sold these collections for hundred thousands of guilders between them because they were so expensive, but they did science at the same time. This is Filippo Bonanni. This is now an Italian. He's a Jesuit. He trained in Rome and he worked with Anastasius Kirchner for a while. And this is one of the first books, Seashells from Recreazione dell'Occhio e della Mente from 1681. So this is the first treatise only concentrating on conchoidal mollusks. And in the book, you can see they are addressing questions of how do these form? And they use mathematics for it. So they actually had to develop mathematics to analyze what they depicted in their paintings and in their watercolors. And this is a link to the person we know at that time who does mathematics is Newton. So using equations, developing equations to find, because this is complicated. The mathematics of this is not easy to understand. And you can see this. This is one course from many, many I found, unveiling the intricate mathematical patterns of seashells, where you can enroll and pay a lot of money in order to understand what's going on and to study mathematics at the moment. So these are the seashells and the mollusks. I already mentioned, what about the butterflies? So we have 4 different butterflies. We have the peacock butterfly, everybody can see that. We have a grayling, which is on the upper right side. We have the painted lady. You can see the painted lady sitting right in the middle of it. And we have number 4. So this was also depicting nature. The most famous painter at the time for butterflies was Otto Marseus van Schriek. This painter is almost unknown. I mean, I've shown you a lot of people and they are known in the literature. He's weird. People consider him to be strange. What I like about him, he was painting in 1664 in Amsterdam. And he had been to Rome before. He was the court painter of the Medici. And when the Duke of Florence, the last Medici, came to Amsterdam, he visited on his first day Marseus van Schriek, and he bought 15 paintings. And on the second day, he went to Rembrandt, because Rembrandt was world famous, and he bought nothing. So this tells you a little bit about the whole scene there and how important these natural, and you can see on the right-hand side, He painted lots of butterflies. This is flowers, insects, and reptiles. And this is what makes him now so awkward these days, because combining flowers with reptiles, that's not our taste. But it's for when you want to understand natural science, because this belongs together. So he was famous for that, and it's called sottobosco. It's another genre, and there are only a few painters doing sottobosco. And here you see two of his examples. This is natural sciences in the 17th century in Amsterdam. And famous. He was meeting on a regular basis with the richest people in Amsterdam and with all the scientists. He was involved in making microscopes. He was involved in making the first boats which could actually dive in the harbor and stay underwater for more than 20 hours. But here you can see the art of that and the science of that. So these are his butterflies. And he was one of the first who actually took butterfly wings and put them into his painting, because that was better than what he could do himself. But then he tried to mimic it and as well. And here you see a very nice example where you can, when we enlarge that, you can see how carefully he depicted these butterflies and how scientifically this was actually done. So this is almost it. There's one last thing, which is very important for MDIBL and for the painting, and these are the caterpillars. I've only talked about the butterflies so far, but the caterpillars are an important part of that. They belong to the butterflies, don't they? And one of the raging questions where do they come from? You know, the classical theory was all these insects come from the mud. And then they looked more carefully. So Marseus von Trick was one of the first who actually saw that there were caterpillars coming out of fruit when they had been injected, or that certain wasps were laying their eggs. So this were raging discussions at the time. And this is the most famous painters in this era, Maria Sibylla Merian, here in a copper plate in 1698. And she was the one who depicted the metamorphosis of the insects the best. So on the right-hand side, you have illustration of the peacock flower and the moth shown as larvae, as pupa, and in adult form. This is what she was specializing in. But she was famous. She also had an unhappy marriage. She got first, her husband died, and then she had two daughters. Her husband died, and then she lived in Frankfurt for a while, and then she moved to Amsterdam, and she flourished in Amsterdam and became famous there. And then she went to the colonies. She got permission in 1699. This was a year after you see her, to go with her daughter to Suriname. And this is what she did in Suriname. So this is the peacock flower and the moth. Here you see other plates of her. You see the mulberry tree and the eggs and larvae of the silkworm moth. And here, I think we all agree, this almost looks scientific now. You can see very nicely, looking at these two watercolors, how the aesthetics change somehow and become more informative. We lose some of the aesthetic beauty, but she is really wonderful. So the Atlantic called it, "This is when science became beautiful." You could turn this around. This is when beauty became science, or whatever way you want to put this. So it's more like art and science, or science and art. It doesn't matter. This is what we wanted to talk about. We wanted to talk about this time when both the art was used for scientific communication, and science was by itself an art. I'm fully aware that when I make this hypothesis, that we are not talking about still lives as an allegory of life and death. But to be honest, I'm bored to death by that because I've been doing this as an art historian forever. It's also a sign, you can see here the shells and the beauty of these flowers and the variety of these flowers and the richness of the Dutch Republic. And you can see on the left-hand side, we didn't talk about this, the porcelain. The porcelain is from China. It's called Krak porcelain, and it's also a sign of richness. And Gloria Swan, who has written wonderful books on that, much better than my lecture, she has written a full book only on these porcelain, Krak porcelain pieces in the Netherlands, in the art of the Netherlands. We have not talked, or only a little bit, about refinement of painting techniques and the exotism which is in there. So this is also about international and the international world. So that's all in there. But I wanted to concentrate on the science. I wanted hopefully to convince you that now I could ask you which of these diagrams or which of these pictures is more scientific. Do you think this rather boring genetic analysis where this is just one set of experiments and then published in Nature, or this rather complex piece of scientific illustration on the left-hand side? Do you realize that I'm joking? I think this on the right-hand side is wonderful. It's a very impressive piece of work, and the artwork in there is also very impressive. But this is still life as a scientific image. I hope you found it interesting. I hope it wasn't too long. We actually made 64 slides in almost 60 minutes. Not bad. Thank you very much for your attention.
Dr. Haller, that was wonderful. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, not only about art and science, but about the history of early Europe. It's wonderful. If you want to stop sharing your screen, we can invite the audience to come in and we'll have some question and answer time. There we go. And maybe, there we go. Maybe Emily, if you want to take the spotlight off. There. So I'm sure folks in the audience, some of you have questions for Dr. Haller. So if you want to just raise your hand or take yourself off mute, that would be great. Dr. Haller, I'm not sure I'm ever.
I mean, you can, there's a lot of assumptions in this talk. You can say, well, I don't believe half of it.
I'm just trying to get past the fact I don't think I'll ever be able to look at a color wheel the same way without seeing different shades of urine. So thank you for that image. That's really nice.
I just love the idea that art was more important than books at one point. Paintings. Yeah. I mean, it's really a beautiful thought, or a thought. It's really interesting.
I have another, some of you may have heard this is a talk about Rembrandt and the anatomy of Dr. Tull. And this is the same theme. So they are preparing the body, they're doing anatomy lessons, and they have also an anatomy book there. And a third of the students are looking into the book, and a third are looking at the body, at the preparation, and a third is looking somewhere else. And it's a very nice demonstration about this discussion, which we had all along when I studied medicine. Is it more important to read the books, or is it more important to do the practical analysis? And I still think, even in science, you have to look at your experiment. You have to understand what's in front of you and not just fall for preconceived ideas.
That's neat. So Dr. Haller, you have a second lecture planned for February 13th, is that right?
Yeah, I know. I know this is hard because we have now done still lives and there is a certain aesthetic quality, but I've tried we talk about scientific diagrams. Now we will talk about how they organize the natural world in around 1600 in a way that you understand what was going on. So we are doing this, for instance, you know, this in chemistry. I mean, we have tables where we have put everything together, and we love tables and diagrams. And they were trying to do the same thing. But at the time, to be honest, they were a little bit more, well, I wouldn't call it disorganized. They were organized, but in a different way. As I mentioned, the past is a different country. They do it differently there. So we will talk about Kunst and Wunderkammern. Emily, you have to help me with the translation of that.
Cabinets of curiosity.
Yeah. And this underestimates the curiosity is there, but the science of the cabinets of curiosity, I think that's fascinating because I mentioned this briefly in between. They accumulated a lot of things and then they had to put it in order. And they tried this with the still lifes, and we'll talk about these cabinets of curiosity. And in German, it's Kunst und Wunderkammer, which is also a wonderful word, and how this evolved, how important this was. I've shown you a glimpse of that. You remember this drawing of the botanical garden, where you could see the museum in the back. So they first looked at the flowers, and then they went into the museum and they looked at all these strange creatures and what they had, their shells, etc. So this will be the second lecture on this period. And then you will have a full understanding of how science was born around 1600. And this is why I do that, how it reflects on what we are doing. I'm a strong believer that when you see how they looked at things, that it helps you to look at our results and at our research from a different angle and perhaps make important discoveries.
That's great. So we hope you all will, oh,
Can I ask
Daphne.
a question?
Yes.
So, Dr. Haller, my first research paper was on Albrecht Dürer, and so I was curious as to why he's your favorite artist.
Mm.
Well, because first he's wonderful. I mean, there is I didn't show that because it's so obvious. He painted lots of different things. He's just a wonderful painter. He's just wonderful. I have a lecture on Dürer. When he was 15, he did self-portrait. This is the most arrogant self-portrait of a 15-year-old I've ever seen, but it's so beautifully done that it's just admirable. But he did, for instance, the great turf. So this piece of grass, and he painted it in the Albertina in Vienna. And I still can't get my head around why he did that. It must have cost him quite some time. And it's just grass. And was it there because this is how he wanted to understand nature? Or was it just to demonstrate that he could paint everything? It didn't matter what he was painting, which would put him in the same realm as Kandinsky. And then he had he was very much interested in science. I mean, Dürer basically considered the art of painting something which was superficial, but he was really interested in the things behind that and what actually were the mathematics of the natural world. And he tried to convey this in his paintings. So it's basically the same theme I've been talking about in this lecture. But for Albrecht Dürer, it's very special and very personal because he met Leonardo, perhaps, but he was traveling a lot. And so I like him a lot.
Thank you. I did too, and I was only a third grader.
Perhaps if I can convince Jerry and Emily, we'll have a lecture, The Travels of Albrecht Dürer and Why He Died.
Sounds great. Oh, that's wonderful. Well, listen, we hope you all will mark your calendars for February 13th and join us for the next iteration of our Art and Science lecture with Dr. Haller. In the meantime, if you are interested in knowing a little bit more about the science side of what Dr. Haller does, he is giving a science cafe on Monday along with his fellow Anastasia Paulman. Sorry, went right out of my head. And they are going to talk a little bit about why a healthy vascular system is so important to aging well. So, Dr. Haller.
Thank you very much, Jerry, but you got it wrong. It's
did.
Anastasia Science Cafe, and I'm just assisting.
Okay. That sounds great. We hope you all will join us on Monday, and we hope to see you on February 13th. So thank you all so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you very much.